Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this new nighttime journey. Settle in comfortably, adjust your pillows, and let your shoulders gently relax. Tonight, we're traveling to Los Angeles into the world of Lieutenant Columbo, the rugged-faced detective in his threadbare raincoat who solves the most complex crimes with apparent ease. A story of unchanging routines, silent corridors, and a near-perfect murder. Thank you for being here with us tonight in this soft, comforting darkness. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a link to help us continue creating these stories that lull you to sleep. And most importantly, leave us a comment to tell us what you thought of this story or suggest a detective you'd like to hear about in our future tales. Now, take a deep breath. Close your eyes if you wish and let the words carry you away. The Los Angeles sun was setting in a gradient of orange and purple, casting long shadows through the windows of the Westwood luxury apartments. It was an elegant 12-story building with a marble lobby, a uniformed doorman, and residents who valued their privacy as much as their social standing. The kind of place where neighbors exchanged polite greetings in the elevator but never really knew the details of each other's lives. On the 6th floor, the apartment belonged to Dr. Victor Harrington, a renowned psychiatrist of 58, who had built his career and fortune treating the anxieties and neuroses of Hollywood's elite. Tall and thin, with gray, silver hair neatly combed back and tortoise-shell glasses that gave him an intellectual air, Dr. Harrington perfectly embodied the successful and respected professional. But that evening, in the immaculate hallway leading to his apartment, something unusual was about to happen. Something would disrupt the perfectly orchestrated routine that governed life in this building and among its residents. Dr. Harrington had a routine. An unchanging routine, predictable as clockwork. Every single day of the week, without exception, he left his office on Wilshire Boulevard at precisely 5:30 p.m. He drove his black Mercedes to his building, arriving invariably at 6:15 p.m. He always parked in the same spot in the underground parking garage, space number 1. He took the elevator to the 6th floor, exited to the left, walked exactly 23 paces to his door, inserted his key into the lock, and entered his apartment. Once inside, his routine continued with the same military precision. He took off his jacket and hung it in the hall closet. He washed his hands in the bathroom for exactly 1 minute. He made himself a martini with 3 olives, no more, no less. He would sit in his leather armchair facing the window and read the newspaper for exactly 45 minutes before preparing his dinner. The neighbors knew this routine. The doorman knew it. Even the cleaning lady, who came twice a week, knew never to disturb Dr. Harrington between 6:30 and 8 p.m. It was his sacred time to unwind after a day spent listening to other people's problems. But on this particular Tuesday evening, the routine was about to be tragically disrupted. In apartment 60, just 2 doors down the same hall, lived Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, a 72-year-old widow who shared Dr. Harrington's appreciation for routine and punctuality. A retired math teacher, she spent her days doing crossword puzzles, reading detective novels, and discreetly observing the comings and goings in the hall from her peephole. It wasn't morbid curiosity. She liked to think, but simply a natural interest in her surroundings. Mrs. Whitmore knew exactly when Dr. Harrington came home each evening. She knew he always took the left-hand elevator, never the right. She knew he always wore the same beige raincoat in the spring, the same gray overcoat in the winter. She knew that on Wednesdays, he always received a visit from a certain Miss Diane Carson, an elegant woman in her 40s who usually stayed for 2 hours. This Tuesday evening, Mrs. Whitmore was in her kitchen, preparing her usual chamomile tea, when she heard the elevator arrive on the 6th floor. She glanced at the wall clock. 6:15 p.m. punctual as ever, Dr. Harrington was coming home. She heard his footsteps in the hallway, 23 steps as usual, then the clink of his keys, then the familiar click of his door closing. But 5 minutes later, she heard something unusual. Dr. Harrington's door was opening again. Quick footsteps in the hallway, then the sound of the elevator pulling away. Mrs. Whitmore frowned. This wasn't normal. Dr. Harrington never went out again once he came in, never. It was against his sacred routine. Driven by curiosity, she went to her peephole and peered into the empty hallway. But something caught her eye. The door to apartment 604 was slightly ajar, which was also unusual. Dr. Harrington was meticulous about security. He always locked his door with 3 turns of the key. Mrs. Whitmore hesitated. Should she go and check? It wasn't her business, after all, but that half-open door bothered her. It was like a discordant note in a perfect symphony. Finally, her curiosity got the better of her. She opened her own door and cautiously walked down the hall. She approached apartment 604 and knocked lightly. Dr. Harrington, are you all right? There was no answer. She gently pushed open the door, which opened silently. Dr. Harrington, she entered the apartment. The entrance hall was spotless, as always. Dr. Harrington's jacket hung in the closet. His keys lay on the console table. Everything seemed normal, then she saw him. Dr. Victor Harrington lay motionless on his living room floor, his eyes open, staring up at the ceiling. A small bloodstain marred his white shirt across his chest. Mrs. Whitmore put a hand to her mouth to stifle a scream. She backed away slowly, her heart pounding, then rushed back to her apartment to call the police. 20 minutes later, apartment 604 was buzzing with activity. Uniformed officers secured the crime scene. Technicians took photographs and lifted fingerprints. The medical examiner was examining the body, and amidst all this organized chaos stood Lieutenant Columbo. Columbo was exactly as Mrs. Whitmore had imagined him from the descriptions she'd read in the newspapers: short, stocky, with messy brown hair that clearly hadn't seen a comb since morning. He wore a rumpled raincoat that had probably been beige originally but was now an indefinable shade between brown and gray. His eyes, however, were sharp and alert, taking in every detail of the scene with an intensity that contrasted sharply with his disheveled appearance. He stood near the body, one hand in his raincoat pocket, the other scratching his forehead thoughtfully. "So, Doc," he said to the medical examiner in a slightly hoarse voice, "what have we got?" The medical examiner, a bald man in his 50s named Dr. Patterson, sat up with a low groan. A single stab wound to the heart, almost instant death. The weapon was probably removed by the murderer. Based on the body temperature and rigor mortis, I'd say he died about an hour ago, maybe a little longer. Columbo nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the body. An hour then, around 6:30 or 7 p.m. Yes. And there's no sign of a struggle. No, none. The clothes aren't torn. No bruising on the hands or arms. I'd say he was taken by surprise. He didn't expect to be attacked. Columbo turned to Sergeant Wilson, a young blonde officer who was taking notes in a pad. "Sergeant, what do we know about the victim?" Wilson consulted his notes. Dr. Victor Harrington, 58, psychiatrist, practice on Wilshire Boulevard, divorced for 5 years, no children, had lived here alone for 3 years. According to the neighbors, he was a quiet man, very set in his ways, no known problems. Set in his ways, you say? Apparently, he did everything at the same time every day. The lady at the end of the hall, Mrs. Whitmore, said you could set your watch by Dr. Harrington's comings and goings. Interesting, murmured Columbo. He walked around the apartment, his hands still in his pockets, his eyes scrutinizing every detail. The living room was impeccably tidy. Not a cushion out of place, not a magazine out of position. On the coffee table was an empty glass that smelled of vermouth. Next to it, a neatly folded newspaper. "He's made his usual martini," observed Columbo. He started reading his paper. Everything was normal in his routine. He went to the window and looked out. The view overlooked Wilshire Boulevard. The city lights were beginning to twinkle in the twilight. So someone comes in, stabs him, and leaves. No apparent robbery. The wallet is still in his pocket with $250 in it. His Rolex watch is still on his wrist. The valuables in the apartment were untouched. He turned to Wilson. Who had access to this apartment? Wilson consulted his notes again. According to the building manager, Dr. Harrington was very careful with his keys. He didn't give them to anyone. The housekeeper, Miss Rodriguez, had a copy, but she only came on Mondays and Thursdays, and she was at home in Brooklyn today. We checked. The manager himself has a master key, but he was in his office all evening, and the door was locked when the victim came in. Miss Whitmore said she heard Dr. Harrington lock his door as usual. 3 turns of the key she recognized the sound. Columbo frowned. So he goes in, locks his door, starts his usual routine, and someone kills him. But how did this someone get in? And how did they get out without a key? Perhaps Dr. Harrington opened the door for someone he knew, Wilson suggested. Possibly. But according to his routine, he never received visitors at this hour. And Mrs. Whitmore, who seems to have an excellent memory for details, says she didn't see anyone other than Dr. Harrington enter through that elevator. Columbo scratched his head, further ruffling his already untidy hair. Something doesn't add up here, something doesn't fit the timing. He approached the entrance and examined the door closely. All 3 locks were intact, no sign of forced entry. Sergeant, I'd like to speak to Mrs. Whitmore and also to the doorman and everyone who works in this building. Someone must have seen something, and that's how Lieutenant Columbo's investigation began. An investigation that would reveal that even the most perfect routines can hide the darkest secrets. But who had killed Dr. Harrington? And, more importantly, how? Dear listeners, you're probably wondering how a murder can happen in a locked apartment, with no witnesses, no trace. Stay with us, because Columbo is about to unravel a mystery where every detail counts, where every second matters. The corridor of routine still holds many secrets. Don't forget to give us a like if you're already captivated by this enigma, and tell us in the comments which detective you'd like to hear in our next stories. The next morning, Columbo arrived at the Westwood luxury apartments at precisely 9 a.m. He had spent the night pondering the case, turning the details over and over in his mind until his wife gently, but firmly, told him to turn off the light and go to sleep. But even in the darkness, his brain continued to work, assembling and reassembling the pieces of the puzzle. The daytime doorman, a man in his 50s named Marcus Johnson, greeted Columbo in the opulent lobby. Marcus had worked in this building for years and knew all the residents by name. Lieutenant Columbo, said Marcus, shaking the detective's hand. It's terrible what happened to Dr. Harrington, such a kind, punctual man. Yes, everyone tells me he was very routine, said Columbo, taking his crumpled notepad from his raincoat pocket. Tell me, Marcus, were you on duty last night? Yes, Lieutenant, my shift is from 2 to 10 o'clock. So, you saw Dr. Harrington came in as usual, at 6:15 sharp. He nodded to me as always. He wasn't very talkative, Dr. Harrington, polite but reserved. And after he went up, did you see anyone else take the elevator to the 6th floor? Marcus thought for a moment, frowning. No, nobody. Well, wait. There was Chen from 608 who came back around 6:30 with his groceries, and Mr. Brad from 612 came down around 7 o'clock to walk his dog, but nothing out of the ordinary. And you didn't see anyone coming down from the 6th floor who didn't live there? No, Lieutenant, it's a very quiet building. The residents value their privacy. Columbo nodded thoughtfully, tapping his pen against his notepad. Marcus, are there any other ways to leave the building besides the main lobby? There's a fire exit in the stairwell, but it sets off an alarm if you open it. And there's access to the underground parking garage, but you need an electronic badge to open the door. And that alarm, did it go off last night? No, Lieutenant, I would have heard him. Of course, of course. Columbo scratched his head. One more thing, Marcus. Doctor, did Harrington often have visitors? Not really. There was a lady who came to see him every Wednesday evening, Mrs. Carson, very elegant. He dined with her, I believe. Miss Carson, do you have her full name? Diane Carson. She lives in Beverly Hills. She always arrived around 7 p.m. and left around 9 p.m. But not yesterday, since it was Tuesday. Exactly. Columbo thanked Marcus and took the elevator to the 6th floor. He knocked on the door of apartment 608 where Mrs. Whitman lived. The door opened almost immediately as if Mrs. Whitman had been expecting him. She was a slim woman with white hair pulled back in a tight bun and intelligent gray eyes behind gold-framed glasses. Lieutenant Columbo, she said, opening the door wide. I was hoping you would come. Please come in, I've made some coffee. Mrs. Whitmore's apartment was the exact opposite of Dr. Harrington's. Where he was minimalist and orderly, hers was warm and cluttered, filled with books, family photographs, and mementos accumulated over a long life. They sat down in the living room, and Mrs. Whitmore poured coffee into delicate china cups. Well, Mrs. Whitmore, Columbo began after taking a sip of coffee. Tell me exactly what happened last night from the beginning. Miss Whitmore sat up straight, clearly pleased to have an attentive audience for her story. I was in my kitchen preparing my herbal tea. It was exactly 6:15 p.m. I know because I was looking at the clock. That's when Dr. Harrington always comes home. I heard the lift arrive and then his footsteps in the corridor. 23 steps, Lieutenant. Always 23 steps from the elevator to his door. Are you counting them? Miss Whitmore looked slightly embarrassed. I'm a former math teacher, Lieutenant. Come is second nature to me, and when you live alone, you notice these little things. Routines are reassuring. I understand perfectly. Go on. So, 23 steps, then the clinking of his keys, then 3 distinct clicks as he locked his door. 3 locks. Do you understand? He was very secure. And then, I heard his door close. Everything was normal. I carried on making my herbal tea. But about 5 minutes later, I heard his door open again. Quick footsteps in the corridor, then the elevator descending. Quick footsteps, you say? Like someone in a hurry. Yes, exactly. It wasn't Dr. Harrington's measured pace. It was different. Columbo leaned forward. His interest clearly piqued. Different. How so? Could you be more specific? Miss Whitman closed her eyes, concentrating on the lighter memory as if the person were smaller and faster, more nervous. Dr. Harrington always walked with a steady, confident gait. Those steps were stealthy, interesting, very interesting. Columbo scribbled a few notes. And you didn't look through your peephole to see who it was? No, not immediately. It was only later, when I noticed his door had been left ajar, that my curiosity was piqued. How long after? Oh, perhaps 5 minutes. I finished making my herbal tea. I went into the parlor. And that's when I noticed through my window that there was light in the hall. Dr. Harrington's door always casts a shadow when it's closed, but that shadow wasn't there. So you went to check? Yes, and that's when I found it? Miss Whitman shuddered slightly at the memory. I'll never forget that image, Lieutenant. Columbo nodded sympathetically. I understand, it's very difficult, but you did exactly the right thing by calling the police immediately. He stood up and went to the window of Miss Whitmore's sitting room. It overlooked an inner courtyard with a fountain and some benches. Miss H died last night. Did you see anyone unusual in the building? Anyone who doesn't live here? No, nobody. It was a very quiet evening. Tuesday night, you understand? People usually stay in. Columbo turned back to her. One last question. It wasn't that you heard someone leaving Dr. Harrington's apartment. You're absolutely certain it wasn't him? Absolutely certain, Lieutenant. I heard, Dr. Harrington walked up that hall for 3 years. I'd recognize his tread among 1,000. It wasn't him. After leaving Miss Whitmore, Columbo spent the rest of the morning questioning the other residents on the floor. Mrs. Chen, an elderly lady of Chinese origin, confirmed that she had returned from shopping around 6:30 p.m. and hadn't noticed anything unusual. Mr. Bradco, a businessman in his 40s, said he had taken his Labrador out for a walk around 7 p.m. but hadn't seen anyone in the hallway. At noon, Columbo went to Dr. Harrington's office on Wilshire Boulevard. It was a smart office on the 3rd floor of a modern glass and steel building. The receptionist, a young blonde woman named Jennifer Mills, had red eyes from crying. "It's so awful," she said, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. Dr. Harrington was a wonderful boss, always kind, always patient. "How long have you worked for him?" Columbo asked. 2 years. He ran his practice very professionally. Everything was always perfectly organized. I have no doubt about that. Tell me, Jennifer, did Dr. Harrington have any patients who might have been unhappy? Perhaps someone who made threats? Jennifer put her head down. No, nothing like that. Dr. Harrington was very well liked by his patients. Of course, some were difficult. That's the nature of psychiatric work, but no one violent or dangerous. And in his personal life, any problems, conflicts? Not that I know of. He was very private about his personal life. The only person he sometimes mentioned was Miss Carson. They were close, I think. Diane Carson. Yes, she often called him here in the office. Columbo noted this in his notebook. Jennifer, yesterday, Dr. Harrington left at 5:30 as usual. Yes, exactly 5:30. He was very punctual. He had a very strict routine. Did everyone know about this routine? Jennifer shrugged. I suppose so. He didn't hide it. He often said that structure and routine were essential for a balanced life. Columbo nodded thoughtfully. One last thing, did anyone come in here yesterday afternoon? Any unusual visitors? It was a normal day. Dr. Harrington saw his regular patients, 4 in all. The last one left at 4:30 p.m. Do you have their names? Jennifer consulted the diary on her desk. Mrs. Patricia Walsh at 2 p.m., Mr. Robert Chen at 3 p.m., Miss Sarah Brennan at 4 p.m., and Mr. Thomas Keller at 4:30 p.m. Columbo wrote down all the names. Thank you, Jennifer, you've been very helpful. As he left the office, Columbo paused for a moment on the sidewalk, watching the cars passing on Wilshire Boulevard. Something about this case bothered him. Something didn't add up with the chronology of events. Dr. Harrington always came home at 6:15 p.m. He locked his door with 3 turns of the key. He would begin his usual routine, and a few minutes later, he was dead, stabbed in his own living room. But how had the murderer gotten in? And more importantly, how had he gotten out? The footsteps Mrs. Whitmore had heard leaving the apartment were the key, Columbo was certain. Light, furtive, nervous footsteps, not Dr. Harrington's. So someone else had been in the apartment. Someone who had killed Dr. Harrington and left, leaving the door ajar. But who was this someone? How had he gotten in? And why had he killed a respected psychiatrist who, by all accounts, had no enemies? Columbo shook his head and lit one of the cheap cigars he always kept in his raincoat pocket. He had a feeling the answer lay in routines, in the corridor of habits Dr. Harrington followed so religiously. Someone knew his routines, someone had studied them, perhaps for weeks or months, and this person had found a way to use them to commit an almost perfect murder. Almost, but not quite, because there was always a flaw, always a detail that didn't add up, and Lieutenant Columbo was determined to find that detail, however small. And you, dear listeners, are you starting to see the pieces of the puzzle falling into place? Or are you as perplexed as Dr. Harrington's neighbors? Stay with us, because Columbo is about to meet Mrs. Diane Carson, and this conversation will reveal surprising aspects of the victim's private life. The mystery deepens, and each clue brings us closer to the truth. If you enjoy solving mysteries with Columbo, don't forget to subscribe and tell us in the comments which clue seems the most important to you so far. That very afternoon, Columbo went to Beverly Hills to meet Diane Carson. She lived in an elegant Mediterranean-style house on a palm-lined street with an immaculately manicured lawn and a white Mercedes parked in the driveway. Miss Carson herself opened the door. She was a woman in her 40s, tall and slender, with auburn hair styled in an elegant chignon and green eyes that showed clear signs of grief. She wore a simple but expensive black dress and pearls around her neck. "Lieutenant Columbo," she said, her voice slightly trembling. "I've been expecting your visit. Please come in." The drawing room to which she led Columbo was tastefully decorated, filled with antiques and paintings that suggested both wealth and culture. She invited him to sit on a cream velvet sofa while she took a seat opposite him in a matching armchair. "I am deeply sorry for your loss, Miss Carson," Columbo began sincerely. "I understand that you and Dr. Harrington were close." Diane's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, we've been seeing each other for 2 years. It wasn't a conventional relationship. Victor was very private, very cautious. But we loved each other. You see him regularly. Every Wednesday night was our night. I would come to his apartment. We would eat together. We would talk. Victor needed structure and routine. Wednesday was our day." "Why Wednesday specifically?" Diane gave a faint smile. "It was the quietest day of his work week. He saw fewer patients on Wednesdays. He could relax, be himself. You understand, Lieutenant, in his work, Victor always had to be the therapist, listening. With me, he could simply be a man." "I understand." Columbo took out his notepad. "Miss Carson, pardon my question, but were you his only romantic relationship?" Diane hesitated for a moment. "As far as I know, yes. But Victor was discreet. He could have had other aspects of his life that I wasn't aware of." "And your husband, Mrs. Carson, where is he?" "He died 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. That's how I met Victor. Actually, I came to see him to help me cope with my grief." "Oh, I'm sorry. That's life, Lieutenant." Diane wiped away a tear that was running down her cheek. "And now I've lost Victor too. It's as if I'm cursed to love people." Columbo looked at her sympathetically. "Miss Carson, where were you last night?" "I was here at home alone. I was reading a book and preparing dinner. Tuesday wasn't our night, so I usually stayed home." "Can anyone confirm that?" "No, my housekeeper leaves at 4 o'clock and I didn't get any phone calls last night." Columbo nodded and noted this. "Did Dr. Harrington seem preoccupied to you lately, perhaps worried about something or someone?" Diane thought for a moment, frowning slightly. "Now that you mention it, yes, the last time I saw him last Wednesday, he seemed distracted. I asked him what was wrong, but he said it was just a difficult patient. He couldn't elaborate because of confidentiality. A difficult patient." He didn't give any further details. "No, but he did say something odd." "He said?" Sometimes helping people understand their own demons can be dangerous, especially when they don't want to face them. Interesting, Columbo murmured. Mrs. Carson, were you familiar with Dr. Harrington's routines? His daily habits? Quite well, I suppose. He told me about them. He was proud of his discipline, his ability to maintain structure in his life. He said that's what allowed him to be a good therapist, to have that personal stability. And other people probably knew about his routines. Victor didn't make a secret of it. He often talked about the importance of routines in his professional articles. I even think he wrote a book on the subject a few years ago. After leaving Mrs. Carson, Columbo returned to the police station where Sergeant Wilson was waiting with news. Lieutenant, I checked the alibis of the last 4 patients Dr. Harrington saw yesterday. Miss Walsh was at a charity dinner in Santa Monica with 50 witnesses. Sir, Jess was at her restaurant in Chinatown, confirmed by her staff. Miss Brennan was at her parents' house in Pasadena, confirmed. And Moore Keller Wilson marked a Columbo pause, consulting his notes. Mr. Keller, Thomas Keller, 42, single, works as a freelance graphic designer. He doesn't have a solid alibi for last night. He says he was at home working on a project, but no one can confirm that. Tell me about Mr. Keller. How long had he been a patient of Dr. Harrington? About 6 months. According to the receptionist's notes, he saw Dr. Harrington every week, on Tuesdays at 4:30 p.m. Tuesdays, always the same day, same time. Exactly, Lieutenant. Like all of Dr. Harrington's patients, he organized his schedule with clockwork precision. Columbo rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Sergeant, I'd like to speak to this Mr. Keller. Do you have his address? Yes, he lives in West Hollywood. Would you like me to call him to arrange an appointment? No, I like surprise visits. You learn a lot more that way. An hour later, Columbo knocked on the door of a small apartment in a modest West Hollywood building. The door opened to reveal a man of average height with messy blonde hair, blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and several days' growth of beard. He wore faded jeans and a black t-shirt stained with paint. Mr. Thomas Keller, Columbo asked. Yes, the man immediately seemed nervous. Who are you? Columbo flashed his badge. Lieutenant Columbo, LAPD. I'm investigating the death of Dr. Victor Harrington. I'd like to ask you a few questions if you have a moment. The color left Keller's face. When did Victor die? How? Last night, you didn't know? No, I don't watch the news. I usually work late. What time? The door opened wider. Please come in, I'm in shock. Keller's apartment was a scene of organized chaos. Computers and monitors covered a large desk by the window. Sketches and graphic designs were pinned to every wall. Books and magazines were piled in every corner. I'm sorry about the mess, said Keller, quickly moving some papers from an armchair so Columbo could sit down. I don't get visitors very often. No problem, said Columbo, settling in. So, Mr. Keller, you were a patient of Dr. Harrington. Oh, for 6 months. I have problems with social anxiety. Victor helped me a lot. Keller sat across from Columbo, his hands trembling slightly. I can't believe he's dead. What happened? We're still investigating. But tell me, you saw him yesterday afternoon, didn't you? At 4:30? Yes. That was my weekly session. Always Tuesdays at 4:30. How did the session go? What time? He shrugged. Normally, I suppose. We talked about my progress, my difficulties interacting with people. Victor was always understanding. And after the session, what did you do? I came back here. I had a project to finish for a client. I worked late into the night. Can anyone confirm that? What time? He clapped his head. I live alone and I work alone. That's partly why I saw Victor. My isolation had become a problem. Columbo looked at his head, carefully observing what time it was. The man was obviously nervous. But was this the normal nervousness of someone being questioned by the police, or was there something else? Mr. Keller, had Dr. Harrington seemed different to you lately? Perhaps preoccupied with what time he thought? Not really, he was always professional, but now that I think about it, during my last session, he asked a lot of questions about my routines, about how I structured my days. Your routines? Yes, he wanted to know if I followed a regular schedule, if I had any daily rituals. He said that for someone with social anxiety, having predictable routines could be very reassuring. And do you have any routines? A few. I get up at the same time every day. I work a fairly fixed schedule. I do my shopping on Sundays. That sort of thing. Columbo stood up and began to make the rounds of the apartment. Hands in his pockets, observing the various graphic designs on the walls. You're very talented, Mr. Keller. These designs are impressive. Thank you, this is my livelihood. Columbo stopped in front of a particular sketch. It was a detailed architectural plan of a building that bore a striking resemblance to the Westwood luxury apartments. That's interesting, Columbo said, pointing at the drawing. It looks like the building where Dr. Harrington lived. Keller stood up quickly, his face going pale. Oh, that's just a design exercise. I like to draw buildings. It helps me concentrate. I see, I see. Columbo examined the plan more closely. It showed not only the exterior of the building, but also the interior layout of the 6th floor with the apartments clearly marked, including apartment 604. Sir, what time is it? How do you know the interior layout of this building? Have you ever visited Dr. Harrington's apartment? No, never. I just imagined what it might be like inside. That's what graphic designers do. We visualize things. But Columbo saw the sweat beading on Keller's forehead. He saw the man's hands trembling more violently, and he knew with the instinct of a seasoned detective that there was more to this story. Mr. Char, Columbo said softly. I think there's something you're not telling me, something important. And I think you'd be much more comfortable if you told me now rather than later. What time did he slump into his chair, burying his face in his hands? For a long moment, the only sound in the room was his labored breathing. Then, slowly, he looked up at Columbo. I loved him, he murmured. I loved Victor, not the way a patient loves their therapist. I was in love with him. And there you have it, dear listeners, a revelation that changes everything. A patient obsessed with his therapist drawing up plans of his building, knowing his routines. Is Thomas Keller the murderer? Or are there still more secrets hidden in this corridor of habits? Stay with us because Columbo isn't finished unraveling this complex case, and the truth will soon emerge in a surprising way. Tell us in the comments if you think which hour is guilty, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of our detective stories. The silence that followed Thomas Keller's confession was heavy and charged with emotion. Columbo said nothing for a moment, letting the man gather his thoughts. He had learned over the years. Years ago, after such a major revelation, it was often best to let the suspect speak for himself. Finally, what hour continued, his voice breaking with emotion. I know it's wrong. I know it's against all the rules. A patient shouldn't have feelings for their therapist. But I couldn't help it. Victor was the first person in years who really listened to me, who really understood me. When did you realize your feelings had changed? Columbo asked gently. About 3 months ago. I started looking forward to our sessions. I thought about him constantly. I started following him. Following him? What hour? Nodded shamefully. I know, it's awful, But I couldn't help it. I just wanted to be near him, to know how he lived. I found out where he lived. I started observing his routines. I knew exactly when he came home each night. Is that how you were able to draw that plan of his building? Yes, I went there several times. I would stand in the lobby, pretending to wait for someone. I would observe, I would sketch. It was my way of feeling connected to him. Columbo sat down again, his face showing compassion despite the gravity of the revelations. Mr. Keller, did Dr. Harrington know that you were following him, that you had feelings for him? No, well, I don't think so. I was trying to be discreet, but last week during our session, he started asking me strange questions about my routines, yes, but also about my fantasies, my obsessions. I had the feeling that he knew something. And what did you do? I denied it. I changed the subject, but I was afraid that he had found out that he would reject me as a patient, and I couldn't bear that thought. Those weekly sessions were all I had. Columbo leaned forward. Sir, what time was it last night after your session at 4:30 p.m.? Did you go to Dr. Harrington's apartment? Keller's eyes widened. No, I told you, I went straight home. I didn't kill Victor. How could I kill someone I loved? Love and violence are sometimes closer than we think, Mr. Keller, especially when that love is unrequited. But I didn't kill him. I swear it on everything I hold dear. Columbo studied Keller's face for a long moment. The man seemed sincere in his despair, but Columbo had seen enough talented liars in his career to know that appearances could be deceiving. Mr. Keller, I need you to come to the station with me to make a formal statement, and we'll need to take your fingerprints and a DNA sample. Am I under arrest? No, not yet, but you're a person of interest in this investigation. I suggest you cooperate fully. Back at the police station, Columbo asked Sergeant Wilson to take Keller's statement while he went back to his office to think things over. He sat down at his cluttered desk, lit one of his cheap cigars, and began to organize his thoughts. He now had several elements. 1. Dr. Harrington was a strict routine man. Everyone knew his habits. 2. He had been killed in his home between 8 p.m. and 9 p.m. during his sacred decompression period. 3. The door was locked when he came in, but someone came out a few minutes later. 4. Thomas Keller was obsessed with Dr. Harrington and knew his routines in detail. Dion Carson had a romantic relationship with the victim but had no alibi for the time of the murder, but something still didn't add up. How had the murderer gotten into a locked apartment? And most importantly, how could he have committed the murder without Mrs. Whitmore hearing a struggle or a scream? The telephone on his desk, the phone rang. It was the medical examiner, Dr. Patterson. Lieutenant, I have the results of the full autopsy. I've found something interesting. I'm listening, Doc. The knife entered the heart with remarkable precision. No hesitant blows, no defensive wounds. A single fatal blow from someone who knew exactly where to strike. Someone with medical knowledge. Not necessarily, but someone who planned this very carefully. And there's something else. I found traces of a sedative in his blood. Midazolam, to be precise. A sedative. But no one has mentioned that he was taking sedatives. Exactly. Which means someone probably slipped it into his martini. The dose wasn't strong enough to make him completely asleep, but enough to slow him down and diminish his reflexes. Columbo jerked upright in his chair. So, the murderer drugged his martini before killing him. Which means, had access to his apartment before he returned. The sedative was already in the glass. After hanging up, Columbo remained seated, thinking intensely. If the sedative was already in the glass, then the murderer must have a key to the apartment or a way to get in without forcing the lock. He called Wilson. Sergeant, I need you to check something. Who has had access to Dr. Harrington's apartment in the last few weeks? The cleaning lady, the manager, anyone. I'll look into it, Lieutenant. An hour later, Wilson returned with information. Lieutenant, I spoke to the manager. He says the only person who had access to the apartment besides Dr. Harrington himself was Miss Rodriguez, the cleaning lady. She came on Mondays and Thursdays and was at her home in Brooklyn yesterday. We checked. Yes, but Lieutenant, I found something interesting. Miss Rodriguez says that 2 weeks ago, she lost her set of keys for a few days. She found them in her bag, but she thinks someone could have taken them and given them back without her noticing. Columbo jumped up. Someone stole her keys, had copies made, and then gave them back. Sergeant, who knew Miss Rodriguez had keys that could have given access to her bag. She says she often leaves her bag in a closet while she cleans. Anyone in the building could not have accessed it, or could anyone who knew when she worked and where she left her things? Columbo thought. Thomas Keller knew Dr. Harrington's routines. Did he also know his housekeepers? Had he observed the building long enough to know when and how he could steal the keys? And something still bothered him. If the murderer was there, why would he leave such obvious clues? The floor plan of the building in his apartment, his confession of feelings for the victim, it all seemed almost too easy. And then there was the persistent question of the footsteps. He had heard light, furtive footsteps leaving the apartment. What was a man of average height? Wouldn't that fit the description? The telephone rang again. This time it was the concierge of the Westwood luxury apartments. Lieutenant Columbo. This is Marcus Johnson. I've just remembered something that might be important. I'm listening, Marcus. About 2 weeks ago, I saw someone leaving the building through the service entrance. It's unusual because that entrance is normally reserved for delivery people and maintenance staff. It was a woman, I think, but she was wearing a cap and sunglasses, so I couldn't see her face clearly. What time was it? Mid-afternoon, around 11 o'clock. Mrs. Rodriguez, the housekeeper, was working that day. I remember because she had asked me to help her carry a new rug into Dr. Harrington's apartment. And you think this woman could have been in the building while Mrs. Rodriguez was working? It's possible, Lieutenant. As I told you, the service entrance isn't monitored like the main entrance. After hanging up, Columbo turned to Wilson. Sergeant, I need you to find out everything you can about Diane Carson, where she was 2 weeks ago. What are her habits? Did she know Mrs. Rodriguez? Do you think Mrs. Carson is involved? I think everyone is involved until proven otherwise, but yes, there is something about Mrs. Carson that bothers me. The next morning, Columbo returned to Beverly Hills. This time, he didn't call ahead. He arrived at Diane Carson's house at 8 a.m., knowing he would probably catch her off guard. And he did. When she opened the door, she was wearing a silk robe and her hair was unstyled. She seemed surprised and slightly irritated to see him. Lieutenant Columbo, it's very early. I apologize, Miss Carson, I just have a few follow-up questions. May I come in? She hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside to let him in. I was just about to have breakfast. Would you like some coffee? That would be kind, thank you. In the kitchen, while she made the coffee, Columbo watched closely. He noticed her hands trembling slightly as she poured the coffee. He noticed the way she avoided her gaze. Miss Carson, I've discovered something interesting. It seems someone had access to Dr. Harrington's apartment before the murder. Someone who had a copy of his keys. Diane nearly dropped the cup she was holding. Really? How is that possible? That's what I'm trying to figure out. Tell me, where were you 2 weeks ago, on a Thursday afternoon? 2 weeks ago, I can't recall. Probably here at home. You weren't at the Westwood luxury apartments. Diane's eyes widened. No, why would I have gone there on a Thursday? Wednesday was our day. Columbo took a sip of coffee, his eyes never leaving her face. Miss Carson, I think you're not telling me the whole truth. I think you knew things about Dr. Harrington that he didn't want you to know, and I think that made you angry. Very angry. Diane put her cup with a smack. I didn't kill Victor, if that's what you're implying. I'm not implying anything, madam. I'm just looking for the truth. Columbo stood up and began pacing around the kitchen, his hands in the pockets of his raincoat. You see, here's what I think happened. I think you discovered that Dr. Harrington was seeing someone else. Perhaps not romantically, but someone who was becoming an important part of his life. And that hurt you. Tears welled up in Diane's eyes. You don't understand. Victor was everything to me. After my husband died, he was my only reason to go on. And when you thought you might lose him, you took drastic measures. But before Diane could reply, Columbo's phone rang. It was Wilson. Lieutenant, I've found something important. You need to get back to the station immediately. And now, dear listeners, we come to a crucial moment in the investigation. Columbo is on the point of discovering the missing piece of the puzzle, the one that will turn the whole case upside down. Who really killed Dr. Harrington? Was it Diane Carson, the jealous soul? Thomas Keller, the obsessive patient, or someone else we haven't considered yet? Stay with us for the resolution of this complex mystery, and don't forget to tell us in the comments who you think is the culprit before the final reveal. Subscribe so you don't miss any of our detective stories. Columbo hurriedly left Diane Carson's house and went to the police station where Wilson was waiting for him with an unusual expression of excitement on his normally impassive face. Lieutenant, you're not going to believe what I found, Wilson said, hearing Columbo hold up a thick file. I've done extensive research on all of Dr. Harrington's patients, and I've found something very interesting concerning one of them. Columbo opened the file and began to scan it. His eyes gradually widened as he was reading. Sarah Brennan, he murmured. The young woman who had an appointment with Dr. Harrington at 4 p.m. yesterday. Exactly. Apparently, Miss Brennan isn't just any patient. She's Thomas Keller's ex-boyfriend. Columbo looked up from the file. Keller didn't tell us that. No, he didn't, and there's more. According to his records, Miss Brennan started seeing Dr. Harrington 4 months ago, not long after her breakup with Keller. She was seeing him for relationship problems and, get this, to deal with the harassment she was experiencing from her ex-boyfriend. What time was he harassing her? According to these notes, yes, constant phone calls, unexpected appearances outside her house, obsessive messages. This fits the profile of someone transferring their obsession from one person to another. Columbo slumped in his chair, thinking hard. So, what time did she start seeing Dr. Harrington to her social anxiety? Meanwhile, her ex-boyfriend is seeing the same therapist for the harassment she's been experiencing from him. Dr. Harrington probably discovers the connection and decides to confront Wilson about what time during their last session. That's why he was asking all his questions about routines and obsessions. Dr. Harrington knew Kelly was obsessed. He probably knew what time she was following him, observing his routines. He was trying to get her to admit her obsessive behavior. Columbo stood up abruptly. We need to speak to Sarah Brennan immediately. Do you have her address? Yes, she lives in Santa Monica. Minutes later, Columbo and Wilson were knocking on the door of a small apartment near the beach. Sarah Brennan was a young woman of about 28 with short brown hair and hazel eyes that betrayed deep anxiety. When she saw Columbo's badge, her face paled. Miss Brennan, I'm Lieutenant Columbo. Perhaps you've heard about Dr. Harrington's death. Yes, she murmured, her voice barely audible. It's awful. I can't believe he's gone. May I come in? I have a few questions for you. Sarah ushered them into a modest but comfortable sitting room. She sat on the edge of the sofa, her hands nervously twisting a tissue. "Miss Brennan, you were Dr. Harrington's last patient yesterday. You saw him at 4 p.m. "Yes, it was my weekly appointment." "How did it go?" Sarah hesitated, looking at her hands. She was different. Dr. Harrington seemed preoccupied. "He asked me a lot of questions about Thomas." "Thomas Keller, your ex-boyfriend?" Yes, Dr. Harrington had discovered that Thomas was also his patient. He was very concerned about certain behaviors Thomas was exhibiting. "What behaviors?" "The obsession. The need to control. The stalking." Sarah looked up at Columbo, tears glistening in her eyes. "Lieutenant, I was afraid of Thomas. That's why I started seeing Dr. Harrington. After we broke up, Thomas couldn't let go. He would call me 10 times a day. He would show up outside my house, outside my work. He would say he loved me, that he couldn't live without me. And Dr. Harrington was trying to help you." "Yes, he was wonderful. He gave me strategies for dealing with the situation, for protecting myself, and he also tried to help Thomas understand his behavior. But yesterday, Dr. Harrington seemed worried." "Why?" Sarah took a deep breath. "He told me he thought Thomas had become obsessed with him in the same way he had been obsessed with me. He said he had noticed Thomas watching his building, following his routines. He said he was going to have to confront Thomas, maybe suggest he see another therapist." "And what did you think of that?" "I was scared. I knew how Thomas reacted when he felt rejected. He was becoming irrational, sometimes violent. I warned Dr. Harrington to be careful." Columbo grabbed his head, noting it all down in his notebook. "Miss Brennan, after your session, where did you go?" "To my parents' house in Pasadena. As I told you when the police called me, my parents can confirm. I stayed there all evening and all night." "Yes, we checked. Your alibi is solid." Columbo stood up to leave, then turned back as if he'd just thought of something. "Oh, one last thing, Miss Brennan. Did Thomas know Miss Rodriguez, Dr. Harrington's housekeeper?" Sarah seemed surprised by the question. "Miss Rodriguez, I don't know why. Just curious. Thank you for your time, Miss Brennan." In the car, on the way back to the station, Wilson turned to Columbo. "Lieutenant, what time do you really think it is? All the evidence points to him." "Too much evidence, Sergeant, that's what bothers me. When a suspect seems too guilty, when all the evidence points in one direction, it's often a sign we're being led astray. But he had the motive, the opportunity, and knowledge of the victim's routines. What more do you need? The truth, Sergeant. The truth never leaves inconsistencies, and there are still things that don't add up in this case." Back at the station, Columbo spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing all the elements of the case. He examined the crime scene photos, reread the witness statements, studied the floor plan Keller had drawn, and suddenly something caught his eye. On Keller's plan, there was a detail that didn't match reality. Apartment 604 was depicted with a slightly different layout than the one he had seen in person. He called the building manager. "Mr. Simons, this is Lieutenant Columbo. I have a question about apartment 604. Did Dr. Harrington have any renovations done recently?" "Yes, Lieutenant. About a year ago, he had a wall knocked down between the living room and the guest room to create a large office space." "Why? And who knew about these renovations?" "Well, all the building staff, of course, and probably the next door neighbors because of the noise from the construction, and Miss Rodriguez, the housekeeper, since she was working there during the renovations." "Mrs. Rodriguez, of course." Columbo hung up slowly, an expression of understanding creeping across his face. He called Wilson. "Sergeant, I need you to find Miss Rodriguez's address, and also call Dion Carson. Tell her I need her in my office tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. It's important. Did you understand anything, Lieutenant? Yes, Sergeant. I think so. I think I know who killed Dr. Harrington and why and how. The next morning, Columbo convened a meeting in the police station's conference room. Dion Carson arrived at precisely 9 a.m., looking tense and worried. Thomas Keller was brought from the cell where he had spent the night after his formal arrest. Sarah Brennan, also summoned, sat as far away from Keller as possible. And to everyone's surprise, Mrs. Rodriguez, the cleaning lady, was also present. "Thank you all for coming," Columbo began, standing in front of a whiteboard where he had pinned photos and notes. "I know you're all wondering why I've called you all here. Well, it's simple. One of you killed Dr. Victor Harrington, and I think it's time the truth came out." A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. Keller half rose from his chair. "You said I was the prime suspect." "Please sit down, Mr. Keller," Columbo said calmly. "Yes, you were a suspect. You had a motive, you were obsessed with the victim. You knew his routines. You'd even drawn a plan of his building." He took out the drawing and showed it to the assembly. "But you see, this plan revealed something important to me. It shows Dr. Harrington's apartment before the renovations, not after. Which means Mr. Keller was never inside the apartment. He just imagined the layout from the outside. Someone who had actually visited the apartment recently would have known that there was no longer a wall between the living room and the old study." He turned to Dion Carson. "Mrs. Carson, you told me that you see Dr. Harrington every Wednesday evening, that you used to meet together in his apartment. You should have known that the layout had changed, but when I first questioned you, you never mentioned this open workspace. Why is that?" Dion pit. "I couldn't remember the details, I was upset. Or perhaps," Columbo said softly, "because you'd never been to that apartment. Perhaps your relationship with Dr. Harrington wasn't what you claimed." He turned to the others. "You see, I checked. Dr. Harrington never had visitors at his home on Wednesday nights or any other night. He was a very private man. His routines didn't include romantic dinners. Miss Carson invented this relationship to give herself a reason to be close to the victim, to explain why she knew about his habits. But how could she know about his habits if she didn't have a relationship with him?" Wilson asked. Columbo smiled slightly because someone else had told him. Someone who was actually in Dr. Harrington's apartment regularly. Someone who had access to his keys, his martini, his entire private life. He turned to Mace Rodriguez. "Isn't that Mothers Rodriguez?" The housekeeper remained motionless, her face impassive. But Rodriguez had been working for Dr. Harrington for 3 years. She knew all his routines. She knew when he came home, what he did, what he drank. She had a key to his apartment, and she had a secret. Columbo pulled out a photograph and showed it to the assembly. It was a picture of Miss Rodriguez with a young woman who bore a striking resemblance to Dion Carson. Mrs. Rodriguez has a daughter. A daughter who looks remarkably like Miss Carson. In fact, they could have been sisters, and this girl had been a patient of Dr. Harrington's 2 years prior. He produced another document. Maria Rodriguez. Age 28. She had been seeing Dr. Harrington for severe depression and suicidal thoughts. But according to these medical records I finally managed to obtain, Dr. Harrington stopped treating her a year and a half ago. He referred her to another therapist. Miss Rodriguez suddenly stood up, tears streaming down her face. He abandoned him. My son needed him, and he abandoned him. He said he couldn't treat her anymore, that she needed someone else, but she trusted him. She felt safe with him. And what happened to Maria? Columbo asked gently, though he already knew the answer. She committed suicide 6 months ago. She overdosed on medication, and it was his fault. If he had continued treating her, if he hadn't rejected her, she would still be alive. Dion Carson also stood up, tears streaming down her face. Miss Rodriguez came to see me months ago. She told me what had happened to Maria. I was devastated. Victor had told me he wasn't taking on any new patients, that he was too busy. But he continued to see Thomas, Sarah, all the others. Why not Maria? Because, said Columbo, Dr. Harrington had recognized that Maria was developing an unhealthy dependence on him, just as Thomas Keller did later. Dr. Harrington was trying to do the ethically correct thing by referring her to another therapist. But Miss Rodriguez didn't see it that way. He turned to Miss Rodriguez. You started planning his death. You knew exactly when he came home, what his routine was. You stole your own keys from your purse and gave them to Miss Carson, didn't you? Miss Rodriguez nodded slowly. Dion wanted to help her. She wanted to understand why Victor had rejected Maria. We thought if she could talk to Victor, she could reason with him. But it didn't work, Columbo continued. So you decided to kill him. Last Tuesday, you went to his apartment while he was at work. You made his martini with a sedative. You waited for him to come home, to drink it. And when the sedative started to take effect, you came out of your hiding place and stabbed him. Where was she hiding? Wilson asked from the hall closet. She knew every inch of that apartment. She knew Dr. Harrington would hang his jacket in that closet, but he'd never look inside. She stood there, waiting for the right moment. Columbo turned to face her. And you, Miss Carson, you were the diversion. You invented this story about a romantic relationship to make us think you were close to Dr. Harrington, to explain how you knew his habits. You thought if we suspected you, we wouldn't look toward Miss Rodriguez. Dion sank into her chair, sobbing. I didn't want him to die. I just wanted to understand. But when Miss Rodriguez told me Maria's story, I was so angry, it reminded me of my own grief, my own loss. But you didn't kill Dr. Harrington yourself, said Columbo. It was Miss Rodriguez. The light footsteps Mrs. Ammer heard leaving the apartment, those were yours. Mrs. Rodriguez, you're a small woman. Your steps are much lighter than a man's. Miss Rodriguez sat down slowly, her shoulders slumped in defeat. He deserved to die. He killed my daughter as surely as if he'd given her the poison himself. No, Miss Rodriguez, Columbo said gently. Dr. Harrington was trying to do the right thing. But your daughter's depression was deeper than any one therapist could handle. It wasn't anyone's fault. It was a tragedy. But killing Dr. Harrington didn't bring Maria back. It just created another tragedy. And so, dear listeners, the mystery of the corridor of habits was solved, not by the obvious suspect, but by someone no one would have suspected. A grieving mother, consumed by grief and rage, who used her intimate knowledge of her victim's routines to commit a near-perfect murder. Almost, but not quite, because there was one detective who was never fooled by appearances, who always asked one more question, who always looked for that tiny inconsistency that revealed the truth. Stay with us for the final epilogue, and please tell us in the comments what you thought of this story and which detective you'd like to hear about next. Your support means everything to us. 2 weeks after the arrest of Mrs. Rodriguez and Dion Carson, Columbo stood once again in front of the Westwood luxury apartments. The afternoon sun cast long shadows on the sidewalk, and the air held that particular golden quality that characterizes Los Angeles in late autumn. He had come to pay Miss Whitmer one last visit to thank her for her help with the investigation. She greeted him with her usual hospitality. The coffee was already brewed. Lieutenant Columbo, she said, pouring the coffee into the china cups. I've been following the case in the papers. What a tragic story, all those lives ruined by grief. Yes, madam, Columbo acknowledged, accepting the cup. It's always like that in these matters. There are never any real winners, just varying degrees of loss. Miss Rodriguez seemed like such a nice woman, Miss Whitmore said. I passed her several times in the corridor, always polite, always smiling. I would never have imagined. No, nobody ever imagines. That's what makes some crimes so difficult to solve. Murderers don't always wear an obvious mask. Sometimes they look like anyone else. Miss Whitmore poured milk into her coffee, stirring thoughtfully. And poor Mr. Keller, he was innocent in the end, but his life is still ruined. His obsession has been publicly exposed. Mr. Keller is now in therapy with another psychiatrist, Columbo said, a specialist in obsessive-compulsive disorder. There is hope for him. With the right treatment, he can learn to manage his tendencies. And Miss Brennan, she's doing well. She's decided to move to another city for a fresh start. Sometimes that's what people need. A place where no one knows their story, where they can rebuild. They sat in silence for a while, drinking their coffee. Through the window, Columbo could see the hallway of the building through Miss Whitmore's open door. That hallway where so much had happened. That hallway of routine that had been the scene of a carefully orchestrated tragedy. You know, Lieutenant said finally, Miss Whitmore, this whole affair has made me think about routines. Dr. Harrington was so attached to his routines, to his structure, and it was precisely that predictability that allowed someone to kill him. Sometimes I wonder if we shouldn't all be a little more spontaneous, a little less set in our ways. Columbo smiled slightly. Perhaps, but routines also give us a sense of stability, of control in a world that can be chaotic. The problem wasn't Dr. Harrington's routines. The problem was that someone used them for malicious purposes. That's right, it's always people, isn't it? Not habits, not routines. But what people decide to do with the information they have. Exactly, ma'am, exactly. Columbo finished his coffee and got up to leave. Mrs. Ammer walked them to the door. Lieutenant, she said before he left. One last question, if you don't mind, how did you know it was Miss Rodriguez? What put you on her trail? Columbo paused, thinking. You know, it was an accumulation of little details. The light footsteps you heard, the fact that the murderer knew not only Dr. Harrington's routines, but also the exact layout of his apartment after the renovations. The sedative in the martini that required prior access to the apartment, and above all, the lack of an apparent motive for the obvious suspects. You mean, what time is Mrs. Yes, Keller was obsessed, certainly, but he had no reason to kill the object of his obsession. Obsessive people want to be close to the person, not lose them. And Mrs. Carson didn't even have a real connection with the victim. Her story didn't hold water from the start, but it served as a diversion, intentionally or not. So, you looked for someone else? Yes, someone with access, a real motive, and the ability to commit the crime. Miss Rodriguez ticked all the boxes, and when I discovered her daughter's story, everything became clear. Miss Whitmore hoolated. You're a remarkable man, Lieutenant. St. Mary Magdal could have used someone like you. Columbia, St. Mary Magdal, Miss Marple's village. Ah, I've read a few of those books. She's brilliant, Miss Marple, but I'm just a simple policeman who asks a lot of questions and never lets go. It's more than that, Lieutenant, it's much more than that. As he walked down into the building's lobby, Columbo passed Marcus, the doorman, who greeted him warmly. Lieutenant, good to see you again. I hope the case is closed now. Yes, Marcus, it's all sorted out. It's a relief. The residents were worried. But now, I suppose everything will go back to normal. Yes, normal, repeated Columbo. Everyone will go back to their routines, their habits. The hallway will just be a hallway again. People will continue to come home at the same time, and take the same routes. It's comforting, isn't it? Routine, predictability. Yes, said Columbo thoughtfully until it wasn't anymore. He stepped out of the building into the golden afternoon light. His old Peugeot was parked along the curb, faithful and a little battered as always. He got in, lit one of his cheap cigars, and sat for a moment, thinking. This case had affected him more than usual. Perhaps because there were no real villains, no calculating, heartless criminals. Just a grief-stricken mother who had made a terrible decision, and another woman, herself in mourning, who had been drawn into a murderous plot out of empathy for that pain. Dr. Harrington wasn't perfect either. He had done what he thought was right by referring Maria Rodriguez to another therapist, but perhaps he hadn't fully grasped how dependent she was on him, or perhaps he had, and that was precisely why he had ended their therapeutic relationship. But the outcome had been the same. A vulnerable young woman had felt abandoned and chosen to end her life. And now, 2 more lives were destroyed. Miss Rodriguez would likely spend the rest of her days in prison. Dion Carson, though less culpable, would face charges of being an accessory. Her reputation was ruined. His life changed forever. Columbo sighed deeply. This was the dark side of his job. Solving the crime never brought the victim back, and punishing the guilty party never made things the way they were before. But it was still important to seek the truth, to ensure that justice was served, because without it, there was only chaos, lies, and uncertainty. He started his car and began driving not toward the police station, but toward his house. His wife was waiting for him. Dinner was probably already on the table, and after dinner, he would sit in his favorite armchair, kick off his tired shoes, and watch a bowling game on television. His own routines, his own habits, the familiar corridor of his own life. And tomorrow, there would be a new case, a new mystery, new suspects, new clues, new questions to ask, because this was what he did, this was who he was. Lieutenant Columbo, in his rumpled raincoat and worn shoes, always asking one more question, never letting go until the truth was revealed. And somewhere, on the streets of Los Angeles stretching out before him in the fading light, someone was already plotting the perfect crime, someone who thought he was too clever to be caught. Someone who had no idea that a small, unassuming detective would soon be knocking on their door with that familiar phrase, just one more thing. And there you have it, dear listeners, how our story of the Corridor of Habits ends. A tale of broken routine, devastating heartbreak, and a detective who is never fooled by appearances. Thank you for spending the night with us, for following Columbo on his patient and methodical investigation. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of our detective stories. Leave a comment if you enjoyed this story. It helps us tremendously to continue creating this content for you. And most importantly, leave us a comment. Tell us what you thought of this story. Did you guess who the murderer was? Which detective would you like to hear in our next story? Sherlock Holmes, Miss Marple, Hercule Poirot, or another detective you love? Your suggestions inspire us and help us create the stories you want to hear. Now, close your eyes. Let your breathing slow down. Feel your body become heavy and relaxed. Imagine yourself walking down a quiet corridor, your steps steady and comfortable, following a familiar routine that brings you security and peace. Let this image gently guide you to sleep. Good night, dear listeners. Sleep soundly, have sweet dreams, and remember that even in the dark